Okay, today we're going to speak about the beginning of the diaspora, specifically the results of the Roman-Jewish wars of the 1st and 2nd centuries. What you're looking at right now is an amazing night photograph of Masada, where some of the rebels against Rome made their last stand, a rather amazing photograph. It's a rite of passage for many Israelis, and in fact many diaspora Jews, to climb Masada. I know I myself, when I was about 18 years old, I went with a kibbutz that I was staying on, and we climbed it by candlelight in the pre-dawn hours and stood on the top watching the sunrise over Moab. And for a long time, especially in my generation, the slogan was, "Masada will never fall again." So against this backdrop, let's have a look at the beginning of the diaspora and the disastrous Roman-Jewish wars. So to start with, we should think a little bit about our sources. I mean, how do we know about this period? First of all, we have some Jewish sources on it, primarily in the Midrash and the Talmud, documents which we'll discuss more extensively later on in the course. There are some difficulties with using these two texts, however. First of all, they're not intended as historical texts. And secondly, they're often composed decades or even centuries after the events that they describe. It's similar to the problem with using the Bible as a historical source. There's a lot of valuable material, particularly for the spiritual and philosophical approach to the debacle of the Roman-Jewish wars, but it can be problematic as a strictly historical source. Also problematic as a strictly historical source, but nevertheless much more fulfilling, is the work of Flavius Josephus, shown here. Not necessarily the way he looked, but it's kind of an interesting looking picture. I doubt he wore a turban quite like that, but nevertheless, let's go on. Josephus was a Jewish leader who was ultimately pressed into Roman service, and he worked directly for the Roman governors, and in fact was well acquainted with the Roman Emperor Vespasian, and especially his son Titus. We know quite a bit about him because he left a large corpus of literature, including a book called The Jewish War, which treats specifically the war of the 1st century, also an autobiography, and also a massive work called Jewish Antiquities, which was a much larger discussion of Judaism as a whole and its history. He wrote in both Aramaic, which was the lingua franca of the age, and he also wrote in Greek. Unfortunately, the Aramaic version, which may have shed different light on what he had to say to Jews, from a Jew to other Jews, is lost. We only have the Greek version, which was written for the victors, written for the Romans in particular, so we have many questions about really what his attitude was. Some historians will view him as a kind of a Jewish traitor for having gone over to the Roman side. Others will say that he was a victim of circumstance and he chose the most viable option possible in those times. We'll set that debate aside for another lecture, but nevertheless, he left an extremely detailed account, if slightly tendentious, that gives us a lot of information about the period in general. Looking at the political context, so we should recall that this is an era of increasing Jewish sectarianism. We spoke about it a little bit last week, but these divisions between Jews grew even sharper and more fractured during the period. We have not yet touched on the growth of early Jewish Christianity. That will be the topic of next week's lecture, but that was also an increasingly difficult element in the stew that was Judaism and the Jewish people at the turn of the 1st century. There's also a lot of messianic fervor that's circulating, something that really affects all of the movements, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, just as much as the Essenes and the early Jewish Christians. And in fact, one of the elements that was very important in the revolutionary movement was competition over which Jewish leader would in fact be the Messiah, the Redeemer of the Jews. Another element of the political context is the gradual and incremental extension of Roman rule over the province, an erosion of Jewish privileges, and an extension of Roman demands on the Jewish people. And sometimes these things descended to, tiny, tiny degrees of significance that were nevertheless extremely important to the population as a whole. For example, there was a question over whether or not a Roman leader could build a house that overlooked the temple courtyard itself, which presents in Jewish law some difficulties because it would have been physically higher than the temple itself, but it also afforded less privacy to the priests and the Levites who were performing the various sacrificial acts. So in retaliation for the building of this palace, the priesthood had a wall built that would extend up over the temple courtyard and prevent vision of what was happening actually in the temple courtyard, and there was considerable violence exerted over this one small construction. And this is just one example of the kind of increasing level of friction that was experienced by the Romans and the Jews at this time. The Zealots were perhaps the most active and corrosive element in the Jewish mix at this time. The Zealots were a loosely defined group of discontents, far more extensive than they had been in the Hellenistic period, and they were also known for their proclivity to violence, meaning they were ready to attack Romans and other Jews with the drop of a hat. Ironically, they had the support of the Idumeans, who were Jews who were forcibly converted several centuries earlier, many of whom were regarded as not Jewish by many of the Pharisaic elements of society, and they turned out to be the most powerful Jewish nationalists of them all, really being very, very aggressive in their defense of their conception of Jewish political autonomy. The massacres went on between the Zealots and the more moderate groups, sometimes in the hundreds and thousands, and they also massacred each other as they competed for the title of the Messiah, because this is something that was brewed about with really quite a bit of energy, the feeling that one of these leaders would ultimately emerge as the political and military redeemer of the Jewish people, and they competed for it in the streets with violence. To give you a sense of the way in which the Zealots dealt with other elements of the Jewish community, there's a very fascinating and famous passage in the Talmud in which the moderate Pharisaic Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai wanted to achieve a form of a compromise with the Romans who were besieging the region, and there was no way that the Zealots who were inside the fortifications would allow him to go out and speak with the Romans. So he faked his own death, and his students asked permission to carry his body out in a coffin for burial. He, meanwhile, was alive inside the coffin, and the Zealots, suspecting that something was amiss, they used iron poles and shot through the top of the coffin, hoping to make sure that Yochanan ben Zakkai was in fact dead. He amazingly survived this ordeal, and once he was outside of the limits of the fortifications, he was able to conduct his negotiations with the Romans, but this gives you a sense of the very difficult relationship between the more moderate Pharisees and the Zealots. So the first Roman-Jewish war was precipitated when Eleazar, who was previously a Sadducee, became a Zealot, and because he was in control of much of the temple ritual at the time, he prohibited the acceptance of sacrifices from foreigners. This was in the month of August in the year 66. And prior to this, non-Jews could easily bring sacrifices to the temple, which was, allowing them to participate in the overall cultic aspects of Jewish worship. And it was very customary that a certain number of sacrifices would be offered in honor of the Romans by Romans. So by rejecting these sacrifices, this was essentially a slap in the face to the Roman authorities, saying that they could no longer continue participating in the temple ritual. And so Agrippa, a Jewish representative of the Romans, sent troops out to force Eleazar to receive these sacrifices as he had previously. Eleazar counterattacked by burning down Agrippa's palace, and in an indication of the socioeconomic elements of this revolt, he also burned down the House of Records, which held all of the records of debts and especially mortgages, because there were many impoverished Jews who felt that they were being aggrieved economically, and by destroying those mortgages, that meant that they would have more freedom to pay their debts. Now, at the same time, a contender for the leadership of the Jewish people, a approved military commander named Menachem, someone who had already attacked successfully the Romans at Masada, entered Jerusalem, seeing that a rebellion was beginning. He immediately sought to vanquish his rival by murdering his father and his uncle, and Eleazar in turn managed to capture Menachem, tortured him until he was dead as well. So this is just an illustration of the kind of infighting that was going on between the Jews, and in fact the story would get much worse. Eleazar behaved treacherously towards the Romans, promising, for example, that soldiers would be spared if they would surrender, and then breaking his word and slaughtering them. On occasion, some were spared if they were to undergo circumcision, but otherwise Eleazar conducted himself really in a thoroughly dishonorable manner. But this was certain to invoke the ire of the Romans. So let's see how the Romans responded. It's not surprising, really. As the news of the revolt spread through the ancient world, there were violence directed at Jews everywhere else. In Crete, in Syria, wherever there was a significant Roman community or Greek community, there was violence against Jews, and the Jews were typically minorities in these regions and were largely hapless. Rome decided to counterattack by sending reinforcements down from Syria. They were not, however, quite successful. The Jewish guerrilla forces were able to harass them on the way and ultimately even stop them before they reached Jerusalem. And so for a very brief period of time, the Jews managed to hold off otherwise overwhelming Roman might and maintain their independence. But this was to be short-lived. The Emperor Nero appointed Vespasian. You can see their busts on the top here, and unlike the picture of Flavius Josephus, these are probably much more accurate reproductions of what they look like. He appointed the general Vespasian to handle the Jewish revolt. And this was, by the way, the context in which Josephus came into Vespasian's circle. Josephus, surrounded by Vespasian's troops, designed a suicide pact with all of his fellow Jewish soldiers. By drawing short straws, he managed to somehow make sure that he was one of the last ones left to survive, and all the other Jews had killed themselves, at which point he turned himself over to Vespasian and he was taken captive. Vespasian took a liking to this intelligent young Jewish man, and his son Titus befriended him, and this is how Josephus began his climb to authority. The Jews, meanwhile, were basically free to do what they wanted for about 3 years early on in the war, as Vespasian realized that they were, destroying themselves quite effectively, and so he allowed these zealots to essentially expend their own energies murdering each other, and he kept his forces quite safe, waiting for the time when he would be able to enter Jerusalem. He was also quite active in overall empire affairs, as he was ultimately appointed the emperor to succeed Nero, and he handed over the operation to his son Titus. Ultimately, Titus was able to enter Jerusalem, and in August of 70, he was able to destroy Jerusalem and especially the temple. The destruction of the temple is, of course, commemorated every year by Jews on the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, which is traditionally understood as the day of the destruction of both temples, as well as the fall of Beitar, which will be later on in the second revolt. At this point, the Romans took their revenge in a very significant manner. Titus slaughtered resistors left and right. Anyone over the age of 17 was captured and exiled, and many were simply set aside for the famous bread and circuses, the gladiatorial games that were so important to the Romans. 2,500 were killed for Titus's brother's birthday party alone, fed to lions and chained before, armed gladiators and so on. Josephus's estimate is that about 1.1 million Jews were killed in this first Roman Jewish war. Probably an exaggeration, but Tacitus, a Roman historian, gives us a more reasonable figure that says that the normal population of the city of Jerusalem was about 120,000 at the time, quite a large city. And because of the fighting in the countryside, it may have swollen to about 600,000. And so you can imagine that within this context, with a large refugee population living within the town, there would be incredible devastation. And there's no doubt whatsoever that the numbers were absolutely atrocious and the Jews suffered heavily. After Titus achieved his victory, which was a foregone conclusion because the Roman Empire was really so much more massive, the Romans were far more expert in their military skills. He went on to construct a whole series of ceremonial arches and coins and other elements that celebrated the defeat of the Jews. Let's have a look at this coin here, which you can see on the right says Judea Capta. Israel is captured, Israel is taken, and you can see this seated woman with her head on her hands that represents the saddened Jerusalem, and the Roman authority looks on with some pleasure and authority. And on the left you see a figure of a Roman authority as well. Down here you see a large view of the Arch of Titus that stands in Rome that celebrates the victory over the Jews. Here's a view from underneath. You get a sense of how powerful it is. And if you look on the right-hand side, see a very important element that's really quite famous in art history. This is a slightly different colored version of it that shows the Romans carrying the Jews off, and the spoils of war includes the menorah, although there's some dispute over that in Jewish sources. And generally this is a depiction of the Jews' subjugation to the Romans at the end of the First Roman-Jewish War. The last stand, however, was at Masada, which was this massive rock formation just north of the Dead Sea. You can see it there in the upper left photograph. And Eleazar and his followers held out there for 3 years. They were able ultimately to withstand a very punishing Roman siege, but in the end they all succumbed to a mass suicide pact, something like the version that Josephus describes in his own life, in which they all took lots and decided to massacre each other, the Romans rescuing only a handful of survivors. Here's a beautiful view of the archaeological dig. You can see on the bottom there are some palaces there that were constructed by previous emperors, and on the top are the fortifications where the Jews made their last stand. You can see the forbidding landscape of the Judean hills in the background. Here's some of the structures that still remain. This is believed to be some kind of synagogue area. And here you can see some dwellings, some living quarters, and so on. And there's even some caves, which may have even had some weapons or fortifications, and what's believed to be a mikveh or a ritual bath, a very important element in the self-purification rituals of traditional Judaism, which may have been practiced to even greater degree by the Zealots. Especially fascinating as they would have a mikveh at the very top of Masada in this incredibly dry environment. It's actually the lowest point on the face of the earth, just next door at the Dead Sea. The devastation after the revolt was phenomenal. The Romans followed a scorched earth policy that destroyed much of the arable land in the region, which they seized anyways, and they declared it all part of the state. The Romans then resold or rented the land to its former owners or to the highest bidder. They destroyed half of the buildings in Jerusalem, and the population was reduced by at least 2/3. Finally, as the last insult, the so-called Fiscus Judaicus, the Jewish tax, which was previously imposed to support the temple. All Jews had to support the temple by paying this tax. It was remained in place. It was held in place even though the temple was destroyed. But instead, the funds were directed to the temple of Capitoline Jupiter, which was in Rome. In other words, the money that Jews used to celebrate their central religious structure and institution was now directed to the upkeep of pagan idol worship in Rome. The tax was also extended to include women and all age groups, which was something that was not part of the original Fiscus Judaicus. And this was really a very clear symbolic gesture that Judaism and the Jewish people were now completely under the control of the Romans. A few decades later, we have a short reprise of the Jewish-Roman War in the Second Jewish-Roman War, sometimes called the Bar Kokhba Revolt. Emperor Hadrian, who in other ways was often considered more of a liberal figure, he imposed several draconian bans which were directed at larger populations but were felt especially hard by the Jews, and there's no question that Hadrian was fully aware of the impact it would have on Jews. For example, his ban on circumcision affected the Phoenicians and Egyptians and others, but the Jews were the ones who were the most fervent about attaching themselves to this ancient ritual, and by banning circumcision, this was seen as direct attack on their national religion. Hadrian attempted to settle large numbers of Romans in Israel to dilute the remaining Jewish character of the region, and he in fact renamed Jerusalem Aila Capitolina, which is a reference to both Hadrian's family, he was one of the Aili, and also the previously mentioned temple of Zeus or of Jupiter in Rome. There's some debate over the chronology of these elements, whether or not these were the cause of the revolt or the revolt was the cause of them, specifically the renaming of Jerusalem, but there's no doubt that the imposition of policies like this sparked a major revolt which broke out in the year 132. Here you can see a coin that Hadrian minted at the time, and there's a reference here to Judea, but on the right there are several references here, and the woman with the begging bowl, or with the sacrificial bowl, excuse me, and with the three children. No reference whatsoever to the Jewish character, more references really to the pagan character of the Roman imposition on Israel. So the Second Roman-Jewish War broke out in the year 132. The Jews had been preparing for it for more than a decade. Jewish workmen, for example, were known to prepare poor weapons for the Romans, and when they were given over as per their demands, the Romans found them unworthy and simply returned them. So the Jews were able to arm themselves to some degree and prevent the Romans from having an extensive amount of arms. They may have also prepared some subterranean tunnels that allowed them to hide out from the Romans, but ultimately there was no way that they could succeed in their attempt to throw off the massive Roman Empire. They were led by a ferocious and talented military leader, Shimon bar Kosiba, known as Bar Kokhba, the son of a star, and his popularity was bolstered by the fact that none other than the older Rabbi Akiva, one of the leading Pharisaic figures of the period, actually believed that Bar Kokhba was in fact the Mashiach, the Messiah. Others disagreed. Rabbi Yochanan of the time said to Rabbi Akiva that grass will grow on your cheeks and the Messiah will not have come. But nevertheless, Akiva's support of Bar Kokhba certainly added to his authority and his popularity. The early rebels of this time managed to take Jerusalem early and construct more defenses and so on, but ultimately there was no way for them to succeed. Their last stand was at Beitar, which was destroyed in August of 135. It's believed that it occurred on the same day, Tisha B'Av, as the destruction of the two temples. This is in many ways known as, in a somewhat flippant way, National Jewish Bad Luck Day, where so many terrible things happened to the Jewish people throughout history, right up through the 20th century as well. Here is a coin from the period minted by the Bar Kokhba forces. They were fond of taking Roman coins and then simply melting them and printing their own designs on top of them. This not only was less expensive because the coins were already prepared. It also took Roman coins out of circulation. And finally, there was a certain level of satisfaction in the symbolic value of stamping out the Roman presence and in putting on a Jewish presence. There's frequently in Bar Kokhba's coins from the period lots of religious metaphors, symbols such as the lulav and so on. You can see on the left here a reference to the temple. So there's no question that the Bar Kokhba revolt was very closely tied to religious values of the era. When the revolution was put down, it was put down with great ferocity and violence. This is the period of the so-called Asara Ruge Malchus, the 10 martyrs of the state. 10 rabbis, including the famous Rabbi Akiva, were captured and were horribly tortured and murdered by Hadrian at the time. Rabbi Akiva's death, of course, along with several others, is memorialized in the Yom Kippur service as he is being flayed alive. He says to his students how all his life he had wanted to be able to fulfill the requisite commandment of the Shema, saying to love the Lord your God with all your soul, and he meant even by giving up his soul. Jews were banned from entering Jerusalem, and in fact even banned from being within eyeshot of Jerusalem. The entire Judean region was emptied of Jews. A major population shift occurred to the Galil region, the Galilee, where there was significant Jewish life continuing, and the exile, which was quite clear really in the first century, was now absolutely confirmed. But there's a famous story that's worth mentioning in conclusion here. At one point, Rabbi Akiva was walking through the ruins of the temple with his colleagues, and they saw a fox running through the ruins. The other rabbis began to cry, and Rabbi Akiva began to laugh. So the other rabbi said, "Rabbi, why are you laughing? This is terrible. Foxes are running loose through the temple." And Rabbi Akiva quoted a prophecy that says that this would in fact happen in order to bring about the redemption. And he says that since we know that Jerusalem is destroyed, we also know, therefore, that the redemption will one day come. Okay, thank you for listening to this lecture, and I look forward to speaking to you next week when we're talking about early Jewish Christianity.